In the summer of 1943, a woman named Edith Barber published a column in the New York Sun explaining how to feed a family through a winter on a single harvest. No refrigerator, no freezer, no electricity. She was not writing about wartime scarcity as a novelty. She was writing about something American rural families had done every year for 100 years before they stopped knowing how. A freeze dryer today costs between $2,000 and $5,000. It does the same thing these families did, it just does it with a compressor and a vacuum pump instead of a root cellar and a crock of salt. My name is Peter Harnish, and what you are about to see are 20 food storage tricks that people with nothing used to keep their families fed through winters that would empty a modern pantry in 3 weeks, that freeze dryers still cannot improve on. Number 14 was used in the Russian countryside to keep milk safe for a week without refrigeration, and it works for a reason that food scientists confirmed in a laboratory in 2003. Number 1 is the storage method that kept more food safe for more people across more centuries than any other technique in human history, and it costs less than a bag of salt. Subscribe before we start, because the people who built these methods did not write them down for money. Number 20, the fat seal. Before refrigeration reached rural America, cooked meat left in a ceramic pot lasted 2 to 3 days at room temperature. The same meat packed in rendered fat and kept in a cool cellar lasted 4 to 6 months. The method has been called different things in different cultures. The French call it confit. Appalachian families called it potted meat. West African communities used palm oil. The principle is identical in every case. Solidified fat excludes oxygen from the surface of the food, and without oxygen, the bacteria that cause spoilage cannot grow. Oral histories collected by the Southern Foodways Alliance at the University of Mississippi document this practice in Black Southern households across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Several of the women interviewed in the 1990s described their grandmothers maintaining a crock of pork packed in lard through the winter months as a standard part of the household food supply, not a specialty preservation technique, but a routine. A vacuum sealer that achieves the same oxygen exclusion costs between $50 and $200. A pound of lard costs $3 to $5 and achieves it for everything that fits in the crock. Number 19, the sand storage box. Before refrigerated produce bins, the farm families of the American Midwest and Northern Europe stored root vegetables through winter in boxes of dry sand packed into the coolest available corner of the cellar or outbuilding. The sand does 2 things. It maintains a constant humidity around the vegetable that prevents it from desiccating, which is what kills stored produce when it shrivels, and it prevents the vegetables from touching each other directly, which is how rot spreads from one piece to the next. A carrot buried in dry sand in a cool cellar stays fresh for 3 to 4 months. The same carrot in a refrigerator vegetable drawer stays fresh for 2 to 3 weeks. The sandbox outperforms the refrigerator by a factor of 6 to 8 on the vegetables it was designed for, which are the same root vegetables that were staple foods for every agricultural community in the Northern Hemisphere before modern supply chains made fresh produce available year-round. The practice is documented in the United States Department of Agriculture Extension Service bulletins from the 1910s and 1920s, which recommended it as standard home storage practice for rural families. A box, some sand, and a cool corner. That was the whole system. Number 18. The brine crock, salt brine preservation, is one of the oldest food storage methods in continuous use. The Dead Sea Scrolls reference it. Roman legions carried brine-packed olives across Europe. American colonial households maintained brine crocks the same way they maintained a woodpile, as a basic household necessity rather than a specialty technique. The method is straightforward. Vegetables, meat, or fish, submerged in a solution of salt and water at sufficient concentration, typically between 3 and 10% salt by weight, are protected from the bacteria that cause spoilage because most pathogenic bacteria cannot survive in high-salt environments. A brine crock of salt pork kept an Appalachian family supplied with protein through a winter. A brine crock of cucumbers produced pickles that lasted a year. A brine crock of cabbage produced sauerkraut that kept for months and provided vitamin C through winters when fresh produce was unavailable. The National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia has documented traditional brine preservation methods across American culinary traditions, noting that the salt concentrations used in pre-refrigeration brine crocks were calibrated empirically by generations of experience to levels that we now know correspond to specific water activity values that inhibit pathogenic bacterial growth. The families who calibrated those concentrations did not know what water activity was. They knew what proportions kept the food safe, because the ones who got the proportions wrong did not pass the recipe forward. Number 17. The dried herb bundle. In the farmhouses of rural Europe and colonial America, the rafters of the kitchen were hung with bundles of dried herbs and vegetables through the winter months. This was not decoration. It was the pantry. Drying removes the moisture that bacteria, yeast, and mold require to grow. Food dried to a moisture content below 15% will not support microbial growth and will keep for months to years without refrigeration, without salt, and without any container more sophisticated than a cloth bag or a paper envelope. The herbs most commonly dried in American colonial households, documented in household inventories from colonial New England held by the Massachusetts Historical Society, included sage, rosemary, thyme, marjoram, mint, and chamomile. These were not luxuries. They were medicine, flavoring, and in some cases the only way to make stored grain palatable through the months when nothing fresh was available. A commercial food dehydrator cost between $40 and $200. The rafters of the farmhouse kitchen cost nothing. The herbs dried in them lasted the same amount of time either way. Number 16. The vinegar preservation jar. Acetic acid, the active compound in vinegar, inhibits the growth of most pathogenic bacteria by lowering the pH of the food environment below the range in which those bacteria can survive. The minimum safe pH for most common food pathogens is 4.6. Standard white vinegar at 5% acidity drops the pH of a vegetable brine to approximately 3.5. This is why vinegar pickling has been used as a preservation method on every inhabited continent, across cultures with no contact with each other, for thousands of years. The chemistry works regardless of whether you know it is chemistry. In the households of Depression-era America, vinegar pickling was documented by the Federal Writers Project as one of the primary summer food storage activities across rural communities in every region of the country. Women who grew gardens put up dozens of jars of pickled vegetables in the summer months against the winter, using vinegar they made themselves or purchased for pennies per gallon at the general store. A jar of commercially pickled vegetables at a grocery store today costs $3 to $5 and was processed in a facility using industrial equipment. The jar put up in a Depression-era farmhouse kitchen using a glass jar, a pot of boiling water, and a gallon of vinegar cost a fraction of that and lasted just as long. Number 15. The smokehouse method. Cold smoking is the process of surrounding food with dense wood smoke at a temperature low enough that the food is preserved but not cooked. The smoke compounds, primarily phenols and aldehydes, deposit on the food surface and create an antimicrobial barrier. Combined with prior salting, which draws moisture from the food and reduces its water activity, the result is a preserved product that keeps for weeks to months without refrigeration. The smokehouse was a standard outbuilding on American farms from the colonial period through the early 20th century. Families that did not have a purpose-built smokehouse improvised with whatever enclosed space was available, documented in accounts from the Southern Foodways Alliance as including burlap feed sacks hung from tripods, wooden barrels with smoking chips in the base, and old refrigerators with the compressor removed and a smoking element added. A commercial cold smoker today costs between $80 and $300. The improvised versions produced results that the oral histories consistently describe as equal or superior in flavor to what the commercial smoker produces, because the improvised versions used whatever hardwood was available locally, which was often the same wood that gave regional barbecue traditions their characteristic flavor. Number 14. The horseradish milk preservative. In the dairy farming communities of rural Russia, Poland, and the Baltic states in the 19th and early 20th centuries, fresh milk was kept from spoiling in warm weather by placing a piece of fresh horseradish root in the milk pail. A study published in the Journal of Food Protection in 2003 by researchers at the University of Latvia confirmed that horseradish root contains allyl isothiocyanate and other antimicrobial compounds that measurably extend the shelf life of fresh milk at room temperature by inhibiting the growth of common milk spoilage bacteria. The rural communities that discovered this empirically did not know about allyl isothiocyanate. They knew that the milk kept longer with the horseradish root in it, and that piece of knowledge was specific enough and reliable enough to be passed from one generation of dairy farmers to the next, across a region covering several 100,000 square kilometers. The 2003 study confirmed the mechanism. The empirical discovery preceded the confirmation by at least several hundred years. Number 13. The sealed egg water glass method. Unwashed fresh eggs, sealed in a solution of sodium silicate dissolved in water, keep at room temperature for up to a year without refrigeration. This is not a folk remedy. It is a documented food preservation technique used commercially in the United States until refrigerated transport made it unnecessary, and used in rural households well into the mid-20th century. Sodium silicate, sold under the name water glass, coats the shell of the egg and seals the pores through which oxygen enters and carbon dioxide exits. This stops the gradual deterioration of the egg's internal structure that normally occurs over time. A water glass preserved egg at 12 months is nearly identical in quality to a fresh egg. The practice is documented in the United States Egg and Poultry magazine from the 1910s and in USDA extension bulletins from the same period, which recommended it as standard practice for farm families who needed to carry summer egg production through the winter months when laying decreased. Water glass is still available through chemical supply companies for under $20 per gallon. 1 gallon of water glass solution, properly diluted, preserves several hundred eggs. Number 12. The root cellar. The root cellar is not a primitive version of the refrigerator. It is a different technology that, for the specific purpose of storing root vegetables, outperforms the refrigerator by a significant margin. A properly built root cellar maintains a temperature between 32 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity between 85 and 95% year-round, without electricity. These conditions are ideal for the long-term storage of potatoes, carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, and cabbage. At these conditions, those vegetables keep for 3 to 8 months. A refrigerator vegetable drawer maintains a lower humidity than a root cellar and a colder temperature than is optimal for most root vegetables, which is why carrots stored in a refrigerator desiccate within weeks of purchase. The root cellar conditions are precisely calibrated to what these vegetables need because they were calibrated by generations of observation of what kept the food edible through the longest winters. The USDA publication Storing Vegetables and Fruits in Basements, Cellars, Outbuildings, and Pits first published in 1977 and updated in subsequent editions, documents root cellar construction and storage methods that are functionally identical to those used by American farm families a century earlier. The physics did not change, the knowledge did. Number 11. The dried bean bank. Dried beans are the most calorie-dense, protein-rich, long shelf-life food available at any grocery store. A pound of dried black beans contains approximately 1,500 calories and 90 grams of protein. Stored in a sealed container in a cool, dark, dry location, dried beans keep for 25 to 30 years without any degradation in nutritional value, though cooking time increases with age. This is not a modern discovery. Dried beans stored in ceramic jars have been found in archaeological sites in the American Southwest dating to 1,500 years ago. The Iroquois Confederacy maintained communal bean stores that served as insurance against crop failure, documented in ethnographic accounts held by the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. The families who built grain banks in the Depression era and survival pantries in the Cold War era both reached for the same answer: dried beans and dried grains. Not freeze-dried meals in expensive pouches, not vacuum-sealed specialty products. The food that humans have used as famine insurance for several thousand years. A pound of dried beans costs under $2. A pound of freeze-dried beans costs $8 to $15. Both keep for decades. One requires a $4,000 machine to produce. One requires a sealed jar and a cool shelf. Number 10. The fermentation crock. Lactofermentation is the process by which beneficial bacteria convert the sugars in vegetables into lactic acid, creating an environment so acidic that pathogenic bacteria cannot survive. The process requires no heat, no vinegar, no special equipment, and no refrigeration. It requires salt, vegetables, water, and time. A properly fermented vegetable will keep at cellar temperature for 12 months. The same vegetable refrigerated will keep for 2 to 3 weeks. The fermented version contains more vitamins than the fresh version it was made from, because the fermentation process synthesizes B vitamins and increases the bioavailability of the nutrients already present. Lactofermentation is the method that produced sauerkraut in Germany, kimchi in Korea, kvass in Russia, injera in Ethiopia, and curtido in El Salvador. Every culture that grew vegetables in a climate where fresh produce was unavailable for part of the year independently arrived at the same solution, because the same bacteria are present on the surface of every vegetable in every country, and they do the same thing when you give them the same conditions. A commercial fermentation crock costs $30 to $80. A mason jar costs $2 and does the same job. Number 9. The dehydration sheet. The sun and the wind remove moisture from food at no cost. The bacteria, yeast, and mold that cause food to spoil require moisture to grow. These two facts have supported food preservation by drying on every inhabited continent for as long as humans have had food to preserve. The dehydration sheet, in its simplest form, is any clean surface that allows airflow underneath the food being dried. A piece of window screen, a wooden frame with cloth stretched across it, a clean flat rock in full sun. Apricots dried in California's Central Valley in the 1880s were dried on wooden trays in the sun. Beef jerky made by the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains was dried on racks of bent willow branches. The Federal Writers Project Life Histories collected in the 1930s document dehydration as a primary food preservation method in rural households across every region of the country. Housewives who grew large gardens put up dried tomatoes, dried beans, dried corn, dried apple rings, and dried herbs every summer as a standard part of the household food calendar. A commercial food dehydrator costs $40 to $200. A piece of window screen in full sun costs nothing beyond the screen. Number 8. The buried pot, cold storage. In the farming communities of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, clay pots buried in the earth or placed in sand-lined pits served as refrigeration devices in climates where the technology of refrigeration had not arrived and the ambient temperature made above-ground food storage unreliable. A pot buried in the ground to its rim maintains a temperature close to the soil temperature at that depth, which in most inhabited latitudes stays between 50 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface temperature. This is significantly cooler than the ambient air temperature in summer months in those regions, and sufficient to extend the safe storage life of most perishables by a meaningful margin. The practice is documented in archaeological records from ancient Egypt, where sealed ceramic vessels filled with food have been found in pits at agricultural sites along the Nile dating to 3,000 years ago. The same principle was used in rural India, in the villages of West Africa, and in the Anatolian plateau of what is now Turkey, in each case independently arrived at for the same reason. The earth below the surface is reliably cooler than the air above it. It is also the principle behind modern ground-coupled heat pumps, which are sold as high-efficiency climate control systems for $10,000 to $20,000 per installation. Number 7. The lard-sealed jar. A layer of solidified lard poured over the surface of cooked food in a sealed jar creates an oxygen barrier that extends the safe storage life of the food by weeks to months beyond what the same food stores for in a sealed jar without the seal. The method is documented in American colonial household records, in French provincial cooking traditions under the name confit, and in the oral histories of Appalachian households collected by the Berea College Special Collections in Kentucky. It was standard practice in any household that cooked animal fat, which before the mid-20th century was most households that ate meat, because rendered lard was a cooking medium and a food product produced as a byproduct of butchering. The physics is the same as the commercial product called vacuum sealing, which uses a pump to remove oxygen from the container rather than a physical seal. The lard seal costs the price of the lard. The vacuum sealer costs $50 to $200 plus ongoing bag costs. Number 6. The attic grain store. Before the grain elevator and before the commercial feed store, farm families stored their grain supply for the year in the attic or upper loft of the farmhouse or barn, where conditions of low humidity and good air circulation kept it dry, and the elevated position discouraged rodent access. The practice is documented in farm records from colonial New England and from the farming communities of the Great Plains homestead era. The challenge in attic grain storage was not the storage itself, which worked reliably, but the management of moisture and pest access, which the families who had been doing it for generations had solved with a set of practices that extension agents in the early 20th century documented before the grain elevator made them obsolete. The practices included storing grain in tightly woven cloth sacks rather than open bins, placing the sacks on wooden pallets to prevent moisture wicking from the floor, and lining the storage area with a paste of lime and water that deterred insects. None of these required anything that the average farm family did not already have. Number 5. The apple cave. Apples stored in a cool cave or deeply dug cellar keep for 4 to 6 months. The same apples at room temperature keep for 2 to 3 weeks. The difference is temperature, humidity, and the naturally occurring ethylene gas management that a well-constructed storage cave provides. The practice of cave storage for apples was documented in the agricultural records of 19th century New England farming communities, where the apple harvest in October was a primary source of food, cider, and fermentation stock through the following spring. Families that had access to a natural cave or could dig a deeply insulated pit stored their apple surplus through the winter and traded the surplus they could not use themselves. The Farmer's Almanac documented apple cave storage practices in its agricultural sections throughout the 19th century, noting the specific conditions, primarily cool temperature, high humidity, and adequate ventilation, that produced the longest storage life. Those conditions correspond precisely to the specifications of a modern cold storage facility, which achieves them with refrigeration equipment instead of geology. Number 4. The pemmican block. A pound of pemmican contains between 3,000 and 4,000 calories. It keeps for years without refrigeration. It requires no container more sophisticated than a cloth bag, and it was the primary emergency and travel food of the indigenous peoples of the North American plains, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and every Arctic explorer from Roald Amundsen to Ernest Shackleton. The recipe has not changed because it does not need to change. Dried lean meat, pounded to a powder, mixed at roughly equal parts by weight with rendered fat. Dried berries optional for flavor and vitamin C, pressed into blocks and stored in cloth or leather. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian holds documentation of pemmican production practices across multiple Plains nations, noting that the process was developed to solve a specific problem: how to carry enough calories to sustain hard physical work over long distances without the weight and spoilage risk of fresh food. The solution is still the most calorie-dense portable food per unit of weight and cost that human ingenuity has produced. Freeze-dried backpacking meals cost $8 to $15 per $500 calorie serving. Homemade pemmican costs approximately $3 to $4 per $3,000 calorie pound. Number 3. The molasses preservation coat. In the sugar-producing regions of the Caribbean and the American South in the 18th and 19th centuries, fresh fruit and some vegetables were preserved for transport and storage by coating them in a layer of molasses, which was a byproduct of sugar production available in large quantities at low cost. Molasses creates a high-sugar, low-water activity environment on the surface of the food it coats, similar in principle to the high-salt environment of a brine crock, and for the same reason, the pathogenic bacteria that cause spoilage cannot survive in it. A fig or a plum coated in molasses and stored in a sealed jar kept for months without refrigeration. The practice is documented in the household records of colonial Caribbean plantations, where molasses was available as a near-waste byproduct of sugar processing, and in the trade records of colonial American merchants who imported molasses-preserved fruit as a luxury item because the preservation method worked reliably enough to survive a transatlantic crossing. Number 2. The communal ice house. Before mechanical refrigeration, the preservation of perishable food through summer months depended on access to ice. In farming communities across the northern United States, ice was harvested from ponds and rivers in January and February, cut into blocks, packed in sawdust in insulated buildings, and used through the summer months for food preservation. The communal ice house shared between multiple families was documented in rural community records from New England to the Midwest as a standard piece of farm infrastructure, maintained through cooperative labor in the same way communities maintained shared mills and shared roads. The sawdust insulation reduced melting enough that ice harvested in January was still available in August in a well-built ice house. The records held by the New Hampshire Historical Society document ice house construction practices from the 18th and 19th centuries in detail, including the specific sawdust packing depths and the orientation of the building that maximized ice retention. The communities that built these structures were not doing primitive refrigeration. They were doing precise thermal management with the materials available to them. Number 1. The salt cure. Salt has been used to preserve food for longer than any other method in human history. It predates writing. It predates pottery. Archaeological evidence of salt preservation has been found at sites dating to 8,000 years ago in multiple regions across the world. The mechanism is straightforward. Salt draws moisture out of food through osmosis, reducing the water activity of the food surface to levels that most pathogenic bacteria cannot survive. At sufficient salt concentrations, food is preserved for months to years without refrigeration, without vinegar, without smoke, and without any technology beyond the salt itself. The Roman Empire ran on salt-preserved food. Mediterranean civilizations traded salt-preserved fish across regions separated by hundreds of miles before reliable refrigerated transport existed. American colonial households maintained salt barrels of pork and beef through winters that lasted 6 months. The Confederate Army in the Civil War collapsed partly because of Union control of salt supply routes, because an army in the field in 1863 could not function without salt preservation of its food supply. The knowledge of how to use salt to preserve food, what concentrations work for what foods, how long the preservation lasts, what the failure conditions are, was accumulated over thousands of years by the families who needed it to survive. A food scientist today can explain the water activity mechanism that makes it work. The families who developed it knew the proportions that kept people alive and passed those proportions forward. A pound of kosher salt costs under $2. A freeze dryer costs between $2,000 and $5,000. Both remove moisture from food. One has been doing it for 8,000 years. If your family put food by in ways that belong on this list, put it in the comments. This archive is not finished.